I'm Suzanne. I'm a Sri Lankan Australian. I'm going to use tea as my chat starter to ask Asian Aussies, is Australia their cup of tea? If not, what is? And what would they do if they could to change things to make Australia taste better? I thought I'd give this hipster stuff up, get back to my Sri Lankan roots.
Roll up, gather round, we on the blockade, 24/7 and we're not gonna fade.
In this episode, I'm speaking with the dynamic, outspoken and enigmatic Jonathan Sri. Activist, politician, musician and poet, Jono's a force to be reckoned with.
So now we're all rising up against the politicians and the corporations. We're in here to sign petitions. We're here for liberation. We tell free the refugees.
I've been invited to hang at Jono's groovy houseboat so I can learn more about his quest for equality and justice. He tells us about growing up in Brisbane and his pathway to finding his identity while championing the authenticity of what Australia should be. We'll be bonding over our shared heritage with a traditional Sri Lankan tea, strong and sweet, just like our nanas used to make. Oh my God, it's so sweet. It's so sweet.
It's glorious.
But it has that really comforting sensation of childhood when you're drinking your granny's very, very sweet tea. I chose these cups because I got them in Turkey, and when I was in Turkey, the tea boys would come around with trays with these with sugar cubes, and it reminded me of the Sri Lankan way of drinking tea in small cups. So that's why I chose them. I mean, they call it chai in Sri Lanka, and it's not your traditional spicy chai.
Well, I guess so. I mean, chai just means tea, right?
Yeah, chai is tea.
And so if we're talking about like spiced chai, they'd say masala chai.
Masala chai,
yeah.
exactly. And you consider yourself Sri Lankan, or do you consider yourself Australian when you describe?
I think
yourself?
neither these days. I don't think I ever really considered myself Sri Lankan, and I think for a while, probably I considered myself Australian or wanted to be seen as Australian, but yeah, I think these days I'm really cynical of even the idea of Australia, and I've started saying like so-called Australia, and like, you know, what is this thing we call Australian? What is this thing we call Australian?
So you would have gone to school. Where did you go to primary school?
So I
went
to primary school at Craigsley State High. So probably in many respects a fairly mundane suburban childhood. And yeah, went to Craigsley Primary, Craigsley High School, and ended up graduating from Mitchie High. I got expelled in year 11, which is a whole other story.
Rebel at an early age.
Yeah.
But when you were at Craigsley, were you trying to fit in then? Were you trying to not be seen as the other? I know when I was at Scarborough State School, that was my big thing. It was like, make myself as least visible as possible for the others.
Yeah. For a lot of my childhood, I was really at pains to emphasise my Australianness and downplay my otherness. And
what sort of stuff did you do to make that?
I think even little things like wanting to be seen with my mum. So like, I would prefer that if someone had to pick me up from like music practice or whatever, I'd prefer that it was mum picking me up rather than dad, because they'd see my white mum rather than my dark-skinned father.
Wow. So do you think that was your assimilation phase, where it was like, I just want to be like everyone else and make this as easy as possible, and everyone's going to be fine?
I think so. I think like always downplaying your otherness.
Yeah.
But I think what's weird is like sometimes the phases or the states you're in shift depending on the context as well. So even by the time I got to university, I was probably becoming a bit more critical and aware of stuff. But in certain circles, like if you're in like with a whole bunch of white friends from like private schools, maybe again, you're working a little harder to assimilate or integrate or whatever. And so, yeah, it was like, I think sometimes seeing it in stages misses the point that in this space, you're working really hard to assimilate, and in this space, you're code switching and you're embracing other identities a bit more. And so I think over time my identities have become more fluid as well.
Yeah.
And
so when did you start feeling that shift? Was that sort of around year 11 and 12, around that time?
Yeah, so I think in my teens was still sort of very much trying to be a good white Australian kid, and then realising that just wasn't working, and that I was always going to be seen as the other, and no matter how many times you told people, I was born in Brizzy, people would still tell you to go back to where you came from, or ask you why is your skin dark and mine isn't. So I think, by like late high school, I was becoming quite cynical of sort of Australian identity without even really thinking about it. And I sort of went through that stage of being like, well, we're all just human beings.
Okay.
And that was definitely like a bit of a shift where I'm like, yeah, I'm not Australian, but you're not Australian. None of us are Australian. We're all just human beings.
What does that mean, dissecting
yeah,
what Australian
and
means?
so kind of a strong rejection of this idea of like the place doesn't matter and I'm not connected to any particular culture. I'm just a human floating freely in the world. Yeah, which I think was interesting because that was definitely a response to finding that I couldn't meet the criteria of being an Australian. So then after trying to fit that for years and failing, then I was like, well, this thing called Australian is stupid. Why should I even bother, kind of thing.
And then going ahead again, you studied law straight out of school, or did you have a gap year?
No,
or?
so coming out of year 12, I got into a law journalism double degree. And I think for me, I was really interested in writing, and like English was probably one of my favourite subjects. And so thought, okay, I want to be a writer, and journalism was sort of a obvious course. Yeah, did that kind of with this idea of being a human rights lawyer. And by that point, I think I was already quite political and sort of, thinking about effective ways to make change in the world.
So did that just come from you or from your environment, the whole notion of wanting to be political?
Yeah, I think it came from a few places. Like, I was definitely politicised early on by my experiences of trying to fit into Australia and being rejected by it. And I sort of distinctly remember sort of Pauline Hanson the first time round and feeling like her rhetoric was a direct attack on me, even like as a little kid, being like, gosh, these people don't even want me to exist, kind of thing. So that growing up sort of as a teenager in the Howard years and seeing so I think I was probably in year 8 when September 11 happened. And so then watching the war on Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan and all that sort of stuff probably politicised me. I think probably went to my first anti-Howard protest when I was like maybe in year 10 or year 11. But
how did your parents feel about that?
I can't remember really. Like, Mum had a really strong social justice conscience, and I think that's one of the other places that I was sort of politicised from, was that she'd worked as a teacher in remote Aboriginal communities. So while we were growing up in Brizzy, she was teaching in Brisbane, but then as I got towards the end of high school, she started going out to remote communities in the Northern Territory again, and so we'd go out for summer holidays, and that was probably one of my first immersive cross-cultural experiences, really, where you've grown up in white suburban Brisbane, and then you go out to a remote Aboriginal community and you're like, oh, this is still Australia, but everyone's speaking a different language and there are very different cultural norms. And on top of that, seeing just the scale of sort of disadvantage and oppression.
Poverty, absolutely.
And the government just not...
It's fourth world, man.
And seeing very quickly that a core of the problem was that Aboriginal people didn't have control over their own lives. And so all these well-meaning white people coming into the community saying, oh, we're going to help you with this, we're going to help you with that, here's what you should do. Yeah. And Aboriginal people being like, no, we have the solutions. We know what's best for our communities. Why aren't you letting us make these decisions about where funding's allocated or policy or whatever? And so I think, spending a few months living and then later I was working in a few roles up there, that also really politicised me. And
a few roles in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, and so I briefly worked as sort of like a youth worker, kind of sport and rec kind of role, and
that was after uni.
Yeah,
after you left uni. Okay.
But I think just seeing those remote Aboriginal communities was a very stark, difficult to ignore example of how badly Australia was doing when it came to sort of racism and structural oppression.
And you really started using your art as a tool for getting messages across. You used your poetry, you used your music.
I'm not out to throw a spanner in the works. I brought a whole toolbox. I want to fix this broken system because right now half our politicians are for sale.
Tell me a little bit about that and how that became a really effective tool. I know that's always been my go-to, you know, if I need it for delivering messages.
Yeah, so I played instrumental music in school, played clarinet from year 5, and then got into
Strange on the shore,
and all that sort of stuff. So I was sort of like a band geek at school, but started getting into reggae, and then via reggae into hip hop, and started writing raps and lyrics sort of in my late teens. And I think sort of, I don't know, like it's weird actually thinking back on it. I'm like, because I straight away started writing protest lyrics. Like I think looking for something to write about, I was immediately drawn to political material, and so I was listening to a lot of Bob Marley. More Bob Marley than Bob Dylan, but
Okay.
listened to a lot of Bob Marley and got sort of politicized through those sorts of lyrics as
Yep.
well, and was writing that sort of stuff. But then I think it was only later I was like, oh damn, this is actually a really effective way to communicate. Like, I wasn't doing it as a deliberate strategy of I want to shift people's politics
Yep.
or change their minds. I was like, oh, I just want to write about this. And yeah, started doing a fair bit of performance poetry and started going along to poetry slams and getting into spoken word, and at the same time was sort of forming a couple of little hip hop acts and that sort of thing. And yeah, realizing that the spoken word in particular is a very powerful
Yeah.
form to connect with people, even more so than hip hop, I think, because with spoken word you don't have any distractions, it's just the voice, and so really forces someone to really hone in on
and focus.
on the multiple meanings of your lyrics. And I think I've found, as an artist and an activist and now as an elected rep, still poetry and performance poetry is a really powerful and effective way to connect with people.
We're going to make so much noise that you can't ignore it, and we will win. Because you've got the dollars, but we've got the numbers. And now we're all waking up from our comas and slumbers.
But art in general, I think, is just so important to sharing ideas and storytelling and building empathy with the people you're trying to connect with and win over. And I think, I mean, it wouldn't surprise anyone, like, it's a bit of a cliche, but obviously storytelling is
Yeah.
a very powerful form of activism and
Yeah.
advocacy. And so a lot of my music and my poetry still focuses on trying to tell those stories and sort of highlight through emotional experience what's wrong with the system.
And that's art. It's the power of the communication. And I guess through this series, we're trying to encourage young Asian artists to feel they can use those tools to get messages across as well, as much as possible. So activism has been a go-to for you. I know at the latest rally at Kangaroo Point that you were involved in, I was really inspired by the number of young people and the amount of passionate supporters there were, and the sort of stories that were coming across. Did you feel that was a relatively effective opportunity for people to get an idea of what was going on?
I think those sorts of rallies are really powerful because people realise that they're not alone in feeling critical of the system. Like, often people are like, well, what's the point of a rally? It doesn't change anything. But actually, for the people there, you're having this experience of realising that actually there are hundreds of other people who feel the same way as I do, and they all care about this as much as I care about it, and that can be quite empowering, and I think is really important just in and of itself for people to know that they're not alone in the struggle, and that gives them the energy to keep going with the other forms of activism that can sort of reach further out into the community. But those rallies are also just really powerful because it's hard for the government to ignore them, right? Like, it's pretty easy for politicians and media and society more generally to ignore a peaceful protest on a Saturday morning that just sort of marches, on the prescribed route, so to speak. But when you're blocking roads or when you do a sit-in, or, that's really hard for the media to ignore.
Yeah.
They have to pay attention.
It's very visible.
Yeah.
And the fact that there was that interactivity between the asylum seekers and the public, that was so powerful. I
Yeah, the
thought.
Kangaroo Point protests in particular have been another level of emotional
Yeah.
intensity
Yeah.
because you can actually talk
Yeah.
to the men on the inside. They're right there. You can see the people that your government is
That's right.
harming, and it's really hard to look away once you've been there and sort of experience that. And it's been interesting, actually, again, the power of story, but to be able to get the men on the phone and plug them into the PA system so you can hear their voices and they can make
Yeah.
speeches directly to the
Yeah.
rally. Really,
That's what I felt really.
yeah, it really
was
hits
just-
you.
It
And
really hits
and
you.
I think for a lot of people who maybe have been involved in refugee rights activism before or cared about the issue, but now they're stepping up and really paying attention because they're forming human-to-human connections with the people who are being imprisoned.
So you're saying Australia is your cup of tea. It's your cup of tea. But what, in one sentence, if you could say what you would do to make it taste better, what would that be? Apart from putting a few more cardamoms and cloves in our tea.
I think this is a hard question for me. Is Australia my cup of tea? I don't know that it is, and
Okay.
I've thought about this a bit, and I don't know that I can get. I don't think I can sort of prescribe a shopping list or be like, if we just fix this, then Australia
yeah.
would be a better place. I think Australian people are lovely, and I think like our communities are strong and like vibrant, and there's so much cool stuff bubbling away. But I think Australia as a nation is really messed up and needs to be critically examined. But I think one element that I feel is missing and that we need to foster more is that sense of mutual solidarity between different struggles, between migrant community anti-racism struggles and First Nations struggles, and recognising that culture and storytelling and sharing of different musical and artistic traditions across cultures is a really powerful form of resistance in the face of sort of white heteronormative hegemony. Like, to be able to say, no, this is a different way of relating to each other as human beings outside of capitalism, outside of nationalism, is really, really powerful. And I think for me, that's like I said before, in a world that undervalues your identity and undervalues your language and your culture, to continue producing and creating and transforming through culture is really a rebellious and act. Yeah.
Speaking of arts being the best form of communication, I know you often have a bit of poetry that you pull out of your beanie for these sort of occasions. Can you hit us with something that's relevant, poignant, talks about how Australia can become all our cups of tea?
Yeah, okay, so this piece is called Diaspora, and I wrote it a couple years ago now, and it was sort of coming to terms with my sort of sense of identity and identity crisis in a way, and realising that I might not be Australian and I might not be Sri Lankan, but maybe there's power in sort of a fluid or mixed identity. So yeah.
Maybe a band called Identity Crisis. That's what we all need.
Yeah. All right, here goes. We are the diaspora, children of the melting pot, not quite foreign, but always outsiders. We've got gossamer networks stretched in every direction. We are the spiderweb people. Parents cling to memories of obliterated villages. Feet recall the track that led down to where the river is, scattered, dispersed, struggling to stand tall. Disciples of the long-distance phone call, where is the homeland? Satellite maps don't show the old roads. Half-remembered parables, handed down like precious heirlooms, rendered nonsensical by the new paradigm. We must become more Western now. You must get an education now. You'll be a doctor, you'll be well paid, validating all the sacrifices that we made, and each generation drifts further. The mother tongue becomes fragile. Spider threads stretch to breaking point, dreams of Elam, dreams of Mecca, dreams of Zion, dreams of Arcadia. The homeland is now mere folklore. The enclaves are imperfect replicas. The enclaves are havens, fortresses and prisons. The enclaves are shadows where the sun hasn't risen. Small rituals grow heavy with new significance. Weddings have become pompous, extravagant, overcompensations for cultural dissonance, black and white photos, gold halos, non-existent. We are the diaspora, and you don't understand us, and we don't understand us. Has the homeland forgotten us, asked for a better life, dreams of greener pastures? But what do we leave behind? The cousins speak of the hill station with a longing that resembles homesickness, even though they've never been there. Dad flies thousands of kilometres to visit distant relatives who once lived only a couple of streets away, yet back then weren't considered worthy of a visit. Expensive international parcels contain humble snack foods made according to the old recipe. They've grown stale in transit. The old country has changed beyond recognition. Local dialect is peppered with new, unfamiliar inflections. The aunties like the shopping, but they can't stand the crowds. The village is too quiet and the city's too loud, and the kids can't drink the local water. The kids get sick when they drink unfiltered water. Gossamer networks stretched across the globe. International phone cards are hoarded long after the credit is used up. Back in the new country, Uncle's disappointed. His kids no longer want to go to church, to temple, to mosque. They're too young to remember the fights, the shoestring fundraisers, the meetings with council, the triumphant celebrations when it finally opened. They don't understand how hard he worked to build that outpost in a foreign land. How it hurts him when they suggest turning the community centre into a museum. culture meets culture. The child's name is adaptation. What kind of future for the second generation? We straddle chasms, tongues become bridges, but we're still not sure what that thing at the bottom of the fridge is, so we rage against white privilege, rage against their anthems, rage against our impotence, rage against their petty racist tantrums, try to talk like proper locals, try to dress like Westerners. Festivals and harmony days are mere shadows of the best of us. They eat our food, they wear our clothes while spitting in our parents' faces. White teacher thinks she'll fix racism with rainbows and smiling faces. Screw that. You don't know how the rope feels in this kind of tug of war. You can analogize and sympathize, but you've never lived it. We lay ancient melodies over a 4/4 Western drum beat. Who are you to define authenticity? We are amorphous. We are in flux. We are tradition and progress, butterfly and chrysalis, square pegs, fading accents, foreign smelling soap. We are the diaspora, and we live on borrowed hope. That's the poem.
Nice one, nice one. Thank you. Getting a little bit teary, I think.
Ah, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jono. Thanks for this
mate.
time on your beautiful boat.
It is
Sharing tea
beautiful,
with
isn't
you.
it?
It's been
yeah,
really special
it's
for me.
and it's lovely to talk about stuff that we often don't make time for these conversations. Like, obviously, I'm passionate about these issues, but in your day to day, you don't really get enough time to drill down into them. So I think it's really powerful to be having these kinds of chats.
Thanks.
Like, it might seem like a cup of tea, but it's actually a radical political act as well. Like,
Well, that's right. It's the little things. It's the little things that build into bigger ones.
big time.
Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing, dude.
Thanks, mate.